The ocean is older than civilization itself. It existed before language, before trade, before maps, before the idea of nations. It does not recognize human history because it was never part of it. For early humans, the sea was not a resource. It was a boundary, a moving wall that separated survival from uncertainty. Every attempt to cross it came with the same result: drift, fear, or destruction. And yet, somewhere in this chaos, something changed forever. A stone was tied to a rope and dropped into water. No explosion, no invention announcement, no empire rising in celebration, just silence. But in that silence, humanity did something it had never done before. It resisted the ocean, not by conquering it, but by holding position inside it. This single act would eventually shape trade routes, naval wars, colonial expansion, and global economies. Because once you can stop in the sea, you can control where you go. The world before control. Early human civilizations lived close to rivers, not oceans. Rivers were predictable, oceans were not. Rivers had direction, oceans had chaos. So early boats were designed for survival within limits: short-distance travel, coastal navigation, daylight movement only. If something went wrong at sea, there was no recovery system, no braking system, no way to pause reality. A ship either moved or it failed. That was the entire logic of early maritime life. And because stopping was impossible, expansion was impossible. The first solution: heavy stones. The earliest known method of stabilizing boats was simple: a stone, tied with rope, dropped into water. It did not anchor in the modern sense, it only slowed movement. But even this primitive system created a revolutionary outcome: temporary stability. For the first time, humans could fish in fixed zones, wait out small weather changes, load cargo without drifting. This seems small, but in ancient economies, stability is everything, because instability means loss, and loss at sea meant total destruction. The breakthrough idea: interaction, not weight. Early seafarers eventually realized something crucial. Weight alone was not enough. A stone that simply sat on the seabed could still be dragged by current. What mattered was interaction with the seabed. This was the first hidden engineering insight in maritime history. Control does not come from force alone. It comes from resistance design. So, stones began to change, not randomly, but intentionally. Edges were shaped. Holes were drilled, forms were adjusted to reduce slipping. Without knowing physics, early humans had discovered functional design optimization. The birth of anchor thinking. This moment marks a shift in human cognition, because for the first time, humans were designing behavior, not objects. The goal was no longer heavy object in water. The goal was object that behaves a certain way underwater. This is where engineering begins, not with metal, but with intention. Mediterranean, the first testing ground. The Mediterranean Sea became humanity's first maritime laboratory. It was dangerous, but not infinite. Predictable currents made experimentation possible. Here, early civilizations tested different designs: stone weights, wooden frames, rope systems, early composite anchors. Every improvement was tested by survival. If it failed, the ship was lost. If it worked, civilization expanded. The first real impact: trade stability. Once ships could stabilize offshore, everything changed. Trade no longer required immediate docking. Ships could wait for safe harbor entry, avoid storms offshore, coordinate multi-ship fleets. This created something new in history: predictable maritime commerce. And predictability is what transforms societies into systems.
the invisible revolution. No empire announced it, no king recorded it as a breakthrough, but anchoring technology quietly created stable trade networks, safer maritime routes, early naval coordination, colonial economic growth. And once these systems stabilized, power began to shift toward the sea. End of Episode 1. The ocean was no longer just a boundary. It had become a controllable environment, slowly, imperfectly, but permanently. And civilization had taken its first step toward maritime dominance. Episodes 2 through 5 Blueprint, Full Expansion Roadmap. Episode 2, The Phoenician Maritime Empire. Focus, first true ocean trading civilization, systematic anchor engineering, maritime logistics networks. Key story, Phoenicians turning anchoring into economic power, ports becoming controlled economic nodes, early global trade system forming. Core theme, anchors created the first trade empire infrastructure. Episode 3, Greek and Roman naval engineering. Focus, iron anchor evolution, military naval dominance, grain supply control through sea routes. Key story, Rome controlling the Mediterranean through anchored fleets, naval warfare strategy based on stable positioning, engineering upgrades, flukes and chains. Core theme, anchors became instruments of empire control. Episode 4, Age of Exploration Revolution. Focus, global ocean travel expansion, European maritime empires, colonization logistics systems. Key story, long voyages possible only due to anchoring systems, ports across continents connected, global trade networks formed. Core theme, anchors enabled global colonization systems. Episode 5, The Modern Shipping World. Focus, cargo ships and industrial anchoring, global supply chain dependency, offshore engineering, oil rigs, platforms. Key story, modern economy depends on maritime anchoring. Failure risks equal global economic collapse. Satellite navigation plus anchor systems combined.
The Mediterranean Sea has no single ruler. It connects continents, cultures, and civilizations, but it also destroys them with equal ease. For most early societies, it remained a dangerous corridor of opportunity. Only a few dared to treat it as something more than a boundary. Among them was a civilization that did not build the largest armies nor the strongest fortresses. Instead, they built something far more enduring, a network. The Phoenicians did not expand through conquest in the traditional sense. They expanded through control of movement. And at the center of that control was a quiet, overlooked technology that made their dominance possible. The anchor. Not as a weapon, not as a symbol, but as infrastructure. Because once a ship can stop safely in foreign waters, it no longer needs permission to exist there. It becomes temporary territory, a floating extension of its homeland. And in that moment, maritime trade stops being travel. It becomes occupation without land. The Phoenician advantage, control without empire. The Phoenicians emerged along the narrow coastal strip of the eastern Mediterranean in regions that today correspond to Lebanon and parts of Syria and Israel. Their geography was limited. Mountains restricted inland expansion. Resources were scarce. Agriculture alone could not sustain long-term growth. But the sea offered something different, opportunity without borders. Unlike inland civilizations, they did not attempt to conquer vast territories. Instead, they mastered access points, ports, harbors, and coastal nodes. And none of this was possible without reliable anchoring systems. Because early maritime trade faced a fundamental limitation, ships could not safely remain offshore for extended periods. Without anchoring, every trading mission depended on perfect timing, weather, currents, daylight, and port availability. Failure meant total loss. But with improved anchoring techniques, everything changed. Ships could now wait offshore.
They could negotiate access. They could operate on schedules instead of chance. This was not just an improvement in navigation, it was the birth of maritime logistics. Engineering the invisible, the evolution of anchors. Phoenician maritime technology did not rely on sudden invention. It evolved through repetition, failure, and incremental refinement. Stone anchors were modified with drilled holes for better rope control. Wooden frameworks were added to improve seabed grip. The shape of weights began to reflect function rather than convenience. For the first time, anchors were not just objects, they were designed systems interacting with ocean floor physics. Even without modern scientific terminology, Phoenician sailors understood practical principles. Wider contact improved stability, orientation affected holding strength, seabed composition determined effectiveness. This practical knowledge became standardized across fleets, and standardization is where civilization scales. Because once every ship follows the same system, every port can predict behavior, and every voyage becomes part of a larger network. The network effect, how anchors built trade empires. Phoenician expansion was not territorial, it was connective. They established coastal settlements across North Africa, Southern Europe, and Western Mediterranean islands. Each settlement functioned as a node in a larger system of exchange. But the real power was not in the settlements themselves, it was in the ability of ships to reliably arrive, stabilize, and operate in unfamiliar waters. Anchors made this possible. A ship arriving at a foreign coast no longer needed immediate docking permission. It could anchor offshore, remain stable, and wait for conditions to align. This reduced dependency on local control, and reduced dependency leads to economic independence, which leads to influence, and influence becomes power. The hidden transformation, sea becomes space. Before Phoenician maritime systems, the sea was a barrier. After them, it became structured space, not empty, not chaotic, but navigable and organized through predictable anchor points. This transformation had profound consequences. Trade routes became repeatable, shipping schedules became standardized, maritime risk became manageable, economic exchange became continuous. And once continuity exists in trade, civilizations no longer behave as isolated regions, they behave as interconnected systems. The beginning of maritime geopolitics. As Phoenician influence expanded, other civilizations began to recognize a new truth. Controlling land was no longer enough. Controlling access to sea routes became equally important. Ports gained strategic value. Harbors became economic gateways. Anchoring zones became contested spaces. And quietly, without formal declaration, maritime geopolitics was born. Not through war, but through infrastructure. The limitation, why even Phoenician power had a ceiling. Despite their advancements, Phoenician maritime systems still depended on natural constraints, weather unpredictability, limited anchor durability, shallow harbor dependence, seasonal navigation risks. These limitations meant expansion was powerful, but not infinite. To go further, a new material revolution was required, one that would not come from trade networks alone, but from metallurgy, empire building, and war. And that is where Rome enters the story. End of Episode 2. The Phoenicians did not build an empire of land, they built an empire of connection. And in doing so, they proved something revolutionary. Control over movement is more powerful than control over territory.
The Mediterranean had already been transformed once. The Phoenicians had turned it into a network of trade, connection, and controlled movement. But networks are never neutral. Once a system becomes stable, power begins to compete for it. And competition changes everything. By the time Greek city-states rose to prominence, the sea was no longer just a trade corridor. It had become a strategic domain. And whoever controlled movement across it controlled survival itself. Because in the ancient world, grain did not travel by land. Armies did not move without ships.
Cities did not survive without imports. So control of the sea meant control of civilization. And at the center of this control was a technology quietly evolving in the background, the anchor. But now, it was no longer just a tool of stability. It was becoming an instrument of war. The Greek shift, from trade to tactical navigation. Greek maritime development was shaped by geography. Unlike the Phoenicians, the Greek world was fragmented, hundreds of islands, coastal cities, and narrow sea passages. This forced them to think differently. The sea was not just a route, it was a tactical space. Greek ships, particularly triremes, were designed for speed, maneuverability, and coordinated naval engagement. But speed alone was not enough, because naval warfare required something paradoxical: control in motion. And control in motion requires the ability to stop instantly when needed. This is where anchoring systems became strategically essential. Greek naval forces relied on improved anchors to stabilize fleets during night encampments at sea, tactical regrouping, storm survival, pre-battle positioning. Without anchoring, naval coordination would collapse into chaos, and chaos at sea meant defeat before engagement even began. The material revolution. Iron changes everything. The greatest transformation in anchor technology came with metallurgy. Stone and wood had limitations: fragility under stress, limited seabed penetration, inconsistent holding strength. Iron changed all of this. For the first time, anchors could be shaped with precision and durability. Flukes, hook-like extensions, allowed anchors to dig into seabed sediment rather than simply rest upon it. This created a fundamental shift in physics interaction, from passive weight to active engagement with terrain. Iron anchors did not just fall, they locked. And once locked, they resisted forces far greater than their own mass. This made them ideal for increasingly large and complex naval vessels. Rome enters the sea. A land empire learns maritime control. Rome did not begin as a naval civilization. It was a land-based empire built on roads, legions, and territorial expansion. But control of the Mediterranean required something Rome did not initially possess: maritime dominance. The Punic Wars against Carthage forced Rome into naval innovation at unprecedented speed, because Carthage controlled trade routes, and trade routes controlled survival. Rome's response was not just military adaptation, it was systemic maritime engineering. Anchors became central to this transformation. The Roman naval system: control through stability. Roman naval doctrine emphasized coordinated fleet operations. Large numbers of ships had to function as unified systems across unpredictable seas. This required precise anchoring strategies. Roman fleets used advanced iron anchors combined with improved chain systems that allowed better load distribution, reduced drift under wave stress, increased holding power in storms. This allowed fleets to remain stable in hostile environments for extended periods. And stability changed warfare, because now Rome could do something unprecedented: hold entire naval formations in position before engagement. This transformed sea battles from chaotic collisions into planned military operations. The anchor as logistics infrastructure. Rome understood something deeper than earlier civilizations. Empires do not collapse in battle. They collapse in logistics, and maritime logistics depend on predictability. Anchors enabled Roman fleets to secure grain transport routes from Egypt and North Africa, maintain continuous shipping cycles, stabilize port operations across the empire, protect naval supply chains during conflict. In essence, anchors became invisible infrastructure supporting imperial survival. Without them, Rome's vast supply system would fragment, and without supply, even the strongest empire fails. The strategic sea, new rules of power. By the height of Roman naval dominance, the Mediterranean was no longer an open space. It had become a controlled system of naval stations, anchoring zones, protected trade corridors, military checkpoints at sea. Power was no longer defined only by land borders. It was defined by maritime access stability, and anchoring systems were what made that stability possible. Limitations, the edge of ancient engineering. Despite their advancements, Greek and Roman anchoring systems still faced critical limitations: seabed predictability in deep waters, anchor corrosion over time, inefficiency in extreme storms, dependence on manual deployment. These constraints would eventually become more visible as ships grew larger and voyages extended beyond the Mediterranean. A new era of exploration was approaching, and with it, a new level of maritime risk. End of Episode 3. The Greeks refined maritime strategy. Rome turned it into imperial infrastructure, and together they transformed the anchor from a survival tool to a weapon of civilization control.
For thousands of years, humanity lived within a confined world. Civilizations rose along rivers, expanded across continents, and built empires within reachable borders. But beyond those borders lay something vast, unstable, and unpredictable: the ocean. Even the greatest ancient maritime powers, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, treated the open sea with caution. Their world was powerful but limited. It was still anchored to a familiar geography. Then something changed, not in the sea, but in human ambition. Ships began to grow larger, voyages began to stretch further, and slowly the ocean stopped being a boundary. It became a pathway. But this transformation did not happen because the ocean became safer. It happened because humanity learned how to survive longer within its uncertainty. And at the center of that survival was an object that had already shaped empires for thousands of years: the anchor. Now it would decide something far greater than trade routes or naval battles. It would decide global expansion itself. The shift from regional seas to global oceans. The age of exploration did not begin as a single event. It emerged gradually from pressure, economic, political, and technological. European kingdoms in the late medieval period faced a critical limitation. Overland trade routes to Asia were controlled, expensive, and politically unstable. The demand for direct access to spices, silk, and resources pushed maritime innovation forward. But the real challenge was not navigation, it was endurance. Because crossing an ocean is not just movement, it is sustained survival in an unstable system. And survival requires the ability to stop safely when necessary. Without anchoring systems capable of holding in deeper waters and harsher conditions, long-distance exploration would have been impossible. Ship evolution, why size changed everything. As ships grew larger during the 15th and 16th centuries, their behavior in water changed dramatically. Larger vessels meant greater mass, higher inertia, increased wind resistance, stronger storm vulnerability. This created a paradox. Bigger ships were safer in open seas, but harder to control during stopping phases. This made anchoring systems more important than ever before. Because without reliable anchors, even the most advanced ship could not pause safely, wait out storms, anchor near unfamiliar coastlines, establish temporary offshore positions, establish temporary control zones. In exploration terms, stopping was not optional, it was survival. The technological evolution of anchors.
During this period, anchoring systems underwent critical improvements. 1. Iron strength optimization. Iron anchors became stronger, heavier, and more structurally refined. This allowed deeper seabed penetration. 2. Fluke design advancement. Curved flukes increased holding power significantly by improving seabed grip efficiency. 3. Chain integration. Anchor chains replaced simple ropes in many cases, reducing snap failures and improving load distribution. 4. Deployment mechanisms. Mechanical winches and improved deck systems allowed faster and safer anchor deployment. These improvements were not isolated inventions. They were cumulative engineering responses to increasing maritime demand. The age of expansion, when anchors enabled empires. With improved anchoring systems, European maritime powers began global expansion. Ships from Portugal, Spain, England, and the Netherlands crossed oceans that had previously been considered impassable. But every successful voyage depended on one critical factor: the ability to stabilize in unknown waters. Anchors allowed ships to survive unpredictable storms, anchor near unfamiliar coastlines, establish temporary offshore positions, secure supply points during long journeys. Without anchoring, exploration fleets would have been destroyed before reaching their destinations. In this sense, the anchor was not just supporting exploration, it was enabling colonization systems. First global network, the birth of interconnected oceans. As exploration expanded, oceans stopped being isolated bodies of water. They became connected systems: Atlantic routes, Indian Ocean trade, Pacific crossings, intercontinental supply chains. Anchors played a silent but critical role in maintaining this system. Every port, every harbor, every coastal stop depended on controlled anchoring zones. These zones became strategic assets. Control of them meant control of maritime movement, and control of movement meant control of global economics. The dark side: power, extraction, and control. The age of exploration was not purely about discovery. It was also about extraction and domination. Colonial powers used maritime control systems to establish overseas settlements, control resource flow, secure naval dominance, enforce trade monopolies. Anchoring systems enabled ships to remain stable in foreign waters long enough to establish permanent presence. This transformed exploration into occupation, and occupation into empire building. Limits of the era: the sea still resists control. Despite technological progress, the ocean remained fundamentally unpredictable. Even advanced anchors could fail under extreme storms, deep water currents, unstable seabeds, corrosion over time. These limitations meant that maritime expansion still carried significant risk. Ships were powerful, but not invincible, and the ocean always retained final authority. End of Episode 4. The age of exploration transformed the ocean into a global network. But this network was not built on conquest alone. It was built on stability in instability. And that stability was anchored, literally, in centuries of engineering evolution.
Every second of every day, something moves across the oceans, not visibly to most people, not present in daily awareness, but structurally essential to modern life. Ships carry energy, food, medicine, electronics, and raw materials across vast distances. Entire economies depend on routes that most people never see and rarely think about. Yet if these routes stopped for even a short period, the effects would be immediate. Supermarket shelves empty within days. Fuel shortages spread across nations. Industrial supply chains collapse. Global markets destabilize. Modern civilization does not merely use the ocean, it depends on it.
And this dependency is built on a system that has evolved for thousands of years. At the center of that system remains a deceptively simple technology, the anchor. But in the modern world, it is no longer just a tool for stopping ships. It is a mechanism of global stability. The modern shift from exploration to global logistics. The age of exploration expanded the world. The industrial age reorganized it. Steam engines replaced wind. Steel hulls replaced wood. Navigation became precise rather than intuitive. And shipping transformed from exploration into logistics. This shift changed everything, because now ships were no longer traveling into the unknown. They were operating on schedules. Predictability became the foundation of global trade, and predictability required controlled stopping points, ports, harbors, offshore terminals, and anchoring zones. The scale of modern shipping, an unseen empire. Modern cargo ships are among the largest moving structures ever built by humans. They carry tens of thousands of containers, millions of barrels of oil, massive industrial machinery, global food supplies. But their size introduces a critical challenge. They cannot simply stop. Stopping requires distance, planning, and controlled deceleration. And once again, anchoring becomes essential. Not for emergency survival alone, but for coordinated global timing. Anchors in the modern world, precision over power. Unlike ancient iron anchors designed primarily for grip and mass, modern anchoring systems are engineered with precision mechanics. They must account for deep-sea environments, massive vessel weight distribution, complex seabed variations, environmental protection regulations, and high-frequency port operations. Modern anchors are part of integrated systems involving hydraulic winches, electronic monitoring, automated deployment systems, and dynamic positioning support. They are no longer isolated tools. They are components of global infrastructure networks. Ports, the control nodes of global civilization. Ports are not just docking areas. They are strategic control nodes in a planetary system of movement. Each major port functions as a trade exchange hub, a logistics coordination center, a geopolitical asset, a supply chain regulator. Ships arriving at ports depend on anchoring systems for staging, waiting, inspection, and scheduling alignment. This creates a hidden layer of global synchronization, a silent clockwork that keeps international trade functioning. Offshore anchoring, when the sea becomes storage. Modern shipping has expanded beyond ports. Large vessels often wait offshore before entering harbors due to congestion, customs processing, weather conditions, and scheduling constraints. This has created offshore anchoring zones that function as temporary holding systems for global trade. In these zones, ships remain stable while entire economic processes adjust in real time. This is where anchoring becomes invisible infrastructure, not dramatic, but essential. The economic dependency, a fragile global system. The modern global economy is tightly interlinked. Production in one continent depends on raw materials from another. Manufacturing in one region depends on components from multiple others. This creates a chain reaction dependency system. If maritime movement slows, production halts, energy prices rise, food distribution becomes unstable, currency markets fluctuate. And at every stage of this system, anchoring plays a stabilizing role by ensuring controlled maritime flow. Crisis moments, when the system fails. Modern history has shown how fragile this system can be. Events such as major port congestion incidents, severe storms disrupting shipping lanes, geopolitical blockages in key maritime corridors, supply chain disruptions during global crises. Each event reveals the same underlying truth. Global trade is efficient, but not resilient without stability mechanisms. Anchoring systems are part of that hidden resilience layer. Deeper structure, the ocean as a global infrastructure layer. The ocean is often seen as empty space, but in reality it functions as a structured infrastructure layer. Shipping routes act as highways, ports act as cities, anchoring zones act as rest points, maritime signals act as communication systems. This system is not physical in the traditional sense. It is logistical, behavioral, and economic, and it operates continuously. Misconceptions, what most people get wrong. A common misconception is that modern shipping is fully automated and independent of traditional maritime tools. In reality, human coordination is still essential. Environmental conditions heavily influence operations. Anchoring remains critical in both routine and emergency scenarios. Physical maritime infrastructure still determines global trade efficiency. Technology has advanced, but dependence on physical systems has not disappeared. It has expanded. Future outlook, the next evolution of global shipping. The future of maritime systems is shifting toward autonomous vessels, AI-driven navigation systems, smart ports with real-time coordination, environmental optimization technologies, and advanced dynamic anchoring systems. However, even in this future, one principle remains unchanged. Every moving system requires stability, and stability requires controlled stopping mechanisms. Anchoring will evolve, but it will not disappear. It will become more integrated, more intelligent, and more invisible. Philosophical closing, the weight of stillness in a moving world. Human civilization is often defined by movement. We explore, expand, trade, and connect across vast distances. But beneath all movement lies something less visible, the ability to stop, to stabilize, to hold position in uncertainty. The anchor represents this paradox. It is an object of stillness in a world defined by motion. And perhaps the most important lesson of maritime history is not how far humanity has traveled, but how carefully it has learned to remain steady while doing so. Because in the end, civilizations do not collapse when they move too far. They collapse when they lose the ability to hold their place in the storm.